The candles trembled against her breath as she pressed herself against the stone wall, feeling the cold seep through her dress like whispered accusations. His footsteps echoed through the corridor, each sound a drumbeat against her ribs, and she knew that when he found her, when those storm-gray eyes finally met hers, everything would shatter like glass against marble. The silence between them had grown too heavy, too full of unspoken truths that clotted her throat whenever he was near. Before we dive into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ravenwood Manor like dust through gauze, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Elena stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her fingers tracing the worn velvet of the banister, feeling the weight of 100 eyes that weren't there. The marble beneath her bare feet was cold enough to make her bones ache, but she had learned to move silently through this house of whispers and judgment. She had been here for 3 months now, ever since the fever took her grandmother and left her with nothing but a letter of recommendation and the clothes on her back. The letter had brought her to this place to serve as companion to Lady Margaret Ashford, though Elena suspected the old woman needed no companionship beyond her embroidery and her spite. The house breathed around her as she descended, each step a small surrender to the day ahead. Portraits lined the walls like sentries, their painted eyes following her movement with the kind of attention that made her skin prickle. She had learned their names by heart, generation after generation of Ashford blood, each face bearing the same proud curve of the mouth, the same imperious tilt of the chin. But it was the portrait at the bottom of the stairs that made her pause each morning, made her breath catch in her throat like a bird in a cage. Lord Adrian Ashford, the current master of Ravenwood, captured in oils with such precision that she sometimes expected him to step from the frame and demand an explanation for her lingering gaze. The painting showed him as he was, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the light like raven wings and eyes the color of winter storms. There was something predatory in his stance, something that spoke of power held in careful check, and Elena found herself both drawn to and terrified by the intensity of that painted stare. She had seen him only twice since her arrival, brief encounters in corridors where he moved like shadow-made flesh, his presence filling the space until she felt pressed against the walls by the sheer force of his being. He had not spoken to her directly, but she had felt his attention like heat against her skin, had caught the way his gaze lingered on her face with an expression she could not name. The servants whispered about him in the kitchens, their voices dropping to reverent murmurs when they spoke of his comings and goings. He was a man apart, they said, touched by something darker and more complex than ordinary nobility. Some claimed he could see into souls, could strip away pretense with a single look. Others spoke of the way women fell silent in his presence, as if their very thoughts became his to command. Elena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and forced herself to look away from the portrait. Lady Margaret would be waiting in the morning room, her breakfast growing cold while she nursed her grievances against a world that had failed to bend to her will. Elena had learned to navigate the old woman's moods like a sailor reading storms, had discovered that silence was often the safest harbor when Lady Margaret's tongue grew sharp. The morning room was painted in shades of cream and gold, with windows that looked out over gardens that seemed perpetually caught between seasons. Lady Margaret sat at the small table by the window, her silver hair arranged in elaborate curls that spoke of hours spent in her maid's hands. She was a beautiful woman still, despite her 70 years, but there was something brittle about her beauty, like porcelain too often handled. "You're late," Lady Margaret said without looking up from her correspondence, her voice carrying the kind of reproach that Elena had learned to absorb without flinching. "Forgive me, my lady," Elena replied, moving to pour tea from the silver service that gleamed like captured sunlight. Her hands were steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest, despite the way Lady Margaret's pale blue eyes seemed to catalogue every flaw. "The Hartwell ball is tomorrow evening," Lady Margaret continued, accepting the teacup with fingers that bore more rings than seemed possible. "You will attend as my companion, though I suppose there's little point in hoping you'll add anything to the conversation." Elena's breath caught, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had heard the servants whispering about the Hartwell ball, had caught fragments of gossip about who would attend, and what alliances might be forged in the space between dances. The thought of entering such a gathering filled her with equal parts anticipation and dread. "I'm honored by your confidence in me, my lady," she said, though they both knew confidence had nothing to do with it. Lady Margaret's companions were chosen for their ability to fade into the background, to provide an audience for her pronouncements without offering competition for attention. "Adrian will be there, of course," Lady Margaret added, and something in her tone made Elena's skin tighten. "The unmarried daughters of half the county will be circling him like vultures, though I doubt any of them have the strength to hold his interest for long." Elena said nothing, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her efforts to remain composed. The very mention of Lord Adrian's name seemed to change the air in the room, seemed to charge it with possibilities that she dare not examine too closely. "He needs a wife," Lady Margaret continued, her eyes sharp with calculation. "Someone with breeding, with connections that matter. Someone who understands what it means to be mistress of Ravenwood." Her gaze flickered to Elena with something that might have been amusement. Not some foundling with pretensions above her station. The words hit like a physical blow, but Elena had learned to absorb such strikes without showing the damage. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the warning beneath Lady Margaret's casual cruelty, and turned her attention to arranging the flowers in the vase by the window. But as she worked, she felt something rebellious stir in her chest, something that refused to be crushed beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Tomorrow night, she would enter a world that had never been meant for her, would move through rooms filled with people who saw her as less than nothing. And yet, for reasons she could not name, she found herself looking forward to it with an intensity that frightened her. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small tasks and smaller humiliations. Elena read aloud from novels that Lady Margaret found appropriately vapid, organized correspondence that would never be answered, and endured lectures on deportment from a woman who had never known a day of uncertainty in her privileged life. But through it all, she found her thoughts returning to the portrait in the hallway, to storm-gray eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper. She wondered what Lord Adrian would make of her presence at the ball, whether he would even notice her among the glittering crowd of women who would compete for his attention. The afternoon brought clouds that gathered like accusations against the windows, and Elena found herself drawn to the library, where she could lose herself among volumes that offered escape from the suffocating reality of her position. She was reaching for a book of poetry when she heard footsteps behind her, footsteps that made the very air seem to thicken with anticipation. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself face to face with the man who had haunted her thoughts since her arrival at Ravenwood. Lord Adrian stood in the doorway like an answer to a question she had been afraid to ask, his presence filling the space until she felt the walls press closer around them. "Miss Blackwood," he said, and his voice was exactly as she had imagined it, deep and rich as dark honey, with an edge that suggested depths she could not fathom. "I trust you're finding our library adequate to your needs." Elena felt her breath catch in her throat, felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her efforts to remain composed. Up close, he was even more overwhelming than his portrait had suggested, radiating a kind of controlled power that made her feel simultaneously drawn to and terrified of him. "Yes, my lord," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "It's quite beautiful." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of him, sandalwood and something darker, something that spoke of midnight and secrets. His eyes, she realized, were not merely gray but shot through with flecks of silver that caught the light like trapped starfire. "Beautiful things," he said softly, his gaze never leaving her face, "often carry the most danger." Elena felt the words like a caress against her skin, felt them settle in her chest, where they burned with implications she dare not examine. She wanted to look away, to break the spell that seemed to wrap around them like silk, but found herself caught in the intensity of his stare. "I should return to Lady Margaret," she said finally, though the words felt like surrender. "Yes," he agreed, but made no move to step aside, to clear the path that would allow her to escape. "You should." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities, until Elena felt she might drown in it. Then, just as she thought she could bear it no longer, he stepped aside with a grace that spoke of perfect control, and she fled past him like a startled deer. But as she reached the door, his voice followed her, low and dangerous and full of promise. Until tomorrow evening, Miss Blackwood. Elena spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve ending alive with the memory of his presence. She helped Lady Margaret choose jewelry for the ball, endured another lecture on proper behavior, and tried to ignore the way her hands trembled whenever she thought of Stormgrey Eyes and the way he had spoken her name. Evening came with rain against the windows and shadows that gathered in the corners of her small room like whispered secrets. Elena sat before her mirror, brushing her dark hair until it gleamed like water under moonlight, and tried to quiet the wild beating of her heart. Tomorrow would change everything. She could feel it in the air, could taste it like copper on her tongue. Whatever happened at the Hartwell ball, whatever forces were set in motion by her presence in that glittering world, she would meet them with her head held high and her spine straight, even if it destroyed her. The dress Lady Margaret had chosen for her was simple but elegant, a deep blue silk that brought out the violet in her eyes and made her skin seem to glow with inner light. It was not the kind of gown that would draw attention, but it was beautiful enough to allow her to blend with the crowd without embarrassment. As Elena prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of her grandmother's words, spoken in the days before the fever took hold. "You have steel in your spine, child," the old woman had whispered, her eyes bright with something that might have been prophecy. "Don't let them bend you into something small." Elena pulled the covers up to her chin and closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she lay awake listening to the rain and thinking of tomorrow, of dancing in danger, and the way Lord Adrian's voice had wrapped around her name like a promise. She did not know what morning would bring, but she knew that whatever it was, she would face it as herself, Elena Blackwood, orphaned and alone but unbroken. The world might see her as nothing more than a shadow in the corner, but she carried within her the dreams of a woman who refused to disappear. The night stretched ahead of her like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. And somewhere in the darkness of Ravenwood Manor, she imagined Stormgrey Eyes watching over her sleep, waiting for tomorrow with the same anticipation that kept her heart racing long into the night. The ball was still hours away, but already she could feel its pull, could sense the way it would reshape the careful boundaries of her small world. Whatever happened, she would not run from it. She would meet her fate with grace and courage, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of danger, even if it meant falling into eyes that promised everything and nothing at all. The morning of the Hartwell ball dawned gray and misty, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. Elena woke before sunrise, her dreams having been filled with swirling dancers and silver eyes that watched her from shadows. She dressed carefully in her everyday gown, knowing that the hours until evening would pass like honey from a spoon, slow and sweet and somehow inevitable. Lady Margaret was in rare form at breakfast, her excitement manifesting as even sharper criticism than usual. She found fault with everything from the way Elena poured the tea to the arrangement of flowers on the sideboard, her nerves expressing themselves through a litany of complaints that Elena absorbed with practiced grace. "The Hartwells spare no expense for their entertainments," Lady Margaret declared, spreading jam on her toast with movements that betrayed her agitation. "Half the county will be there, and they'll all be watching to see who catches Adrian's eye." Elena felt her pulse quicken at the mention of his name, but kept her expression carefully neutral as she refilled Lady Margaret's teacup. The older woman's pale blue eyes were sharp with calculation, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that she was being evaluated for some purpose she could not guess. "Lady Catherine Pembroke will be there, of course," Lady Margaret continued, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Elena's stomach tighten. "Such a lovely girl, and her father's estates border our northern holdings. It would be quite advantageous if Adrian were to show her particular attention." The words hit Elena like cold water, though she could not have said why. Lady Catherine Pembroke was everything Elena was not: well-born, wealthy, connected to all the right families. It was only natural that she would be considered a suitable match for Lord Adrian, only logical that the whispered conversations would center around such an alliance. Elena forced herself to nod agreeably, as if the prospect of watching Lord Adrian court another woman held no particular interest for her. But beneath her composed exterior, something twisted painfully in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to jealousy. The afternoon was spent in elaborate preparations that reminded Elena forcefully of her position in the household. While Lady Margaret's maid fussed over her hair and cosmetics, Elena was left to ready herself with whatever assistance the younger servants could spare between their other duties. She bathed in water that was barely warm, dressed her hair as best she could with pins that had seen better days, and carefully applied the small amount of powder and rouge that Lady Margaret had grudgingly provided. The blue silk gown transformed her appearance, making her look almost elegant despite the simplicity of her accessories. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elena stood before the mirror in her small room and studied her reflection with critical eyes. She would never be beautiful in the way that mattered to society. Her features were too strong, her background too questionable. But there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of depths unbounded, something that refused to be diminished by circumstance. The carriage ride to Hartwell House was conducted in relative silence, with Lady Margaret fussing over her appearance and offering last-minute instructions on proper behavior. Elena watched the countryside roll past the windows and tried to calm the wild beating of her heart, tried to prepare herself for what lay ahead. Hartwell House blazed with light as their carriage approached, every window glowing like a star against the darkening sky. The circular drive was crowded with elegant equipages, and Elena could hear the sound of music and laughter drifting through the night air like promises of magic. She followed Lady Margaret up the marble steps, through doors that opened onto a world of glittering splendor that took her breath away. The ballroom was a vision of cream and gold, with crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the polished floor, and walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the light until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The guests moved through the space like exotic birds, the women's gowns a riot of silk and satin in every color imaginable, the men elegant in their dark evening wear. Elena felt suddenly small and insignificant, a sparrow among peacocks, but she lifted her chin and followed Lady Margaret into the crowd with as much grace as she could muster. They had barely entered the receiving line when Elena felt a familiar prickle along her spine, a sensation that made her skin tighten and her breath catch in her throat. She turned slowly, inevitably, and found herself looking across the crowded ballroom directly into storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Lord Adrian stood near the far wall, surrounded by a group of gentlemen who hung on his every word, but his attention was focused entirely on her. He was dressed in perfectly tailored black evening wear that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, and there was something predatory in his stillness that made her think of a wolf watching prey. Their eyes met across the length of the ballroom, and Elena felt the world narrow to that single point of connection. Everything else, the music, the laughter, the swirl of dancers, faded into background noise as they stared at each other with an intensity that made her knees weak. Then Lady Margaret's fingers dug into her arm like talons, and the spell was broken. "Come along," the older woman hissed, her voice sharp with disapproval. "We must pay our respects to Lord and Lady Hartwell." Elena allowed herself to be guided through the receiving line, making the appropriate responses to introductions she barely heard. But she remained acutely aware of Lord Adrian's presence, could feel his gaze like heat against her skin even when she was not looking in his direction. The next hour passed in a blur of small talk and careful navigation through social currents that could destroy a reputation with a single misstep. Elena played her part perfectly, fading into the background when Lady Margaret needed an audience for her pronouncements, offering quiet agreement when her opinion was sought. But all the while, she was conscious of being watched, of being studied with an intensity that made her feel like a butterfly pinned to a collector's board. She caught glimpses of Lord Adrian throughout the evening, dancing with Lady Catherine Pembroke, whose golden beauty shone like sunlight, conversing with elderly lords whose approval could make or break a political career, moving through the crowd with a confidence that suggested the world was his to command. Each time their eyes met, Elena felt the same electric shock of connection, the same sense that something momentous was building between them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her duties as Lady Margaret's companion, but it was like trying to ignore lightning. The dancing had been underway for nearly an hour when Elena excused herself to seek refuge in the ladies' retiring room. She needed a moment to compose herself, to quiet the wild beating of her heart and the treacherous thoughts that kept circling back to storm-gray eyes and the way Lord Adrian moved through the ballroom like he owned not just the space but everyone in it. She was making her way along a corridor lined with portraits when she heard voices coming from an open doorway ahead. Something in the tone made her pause, made her press herself against the wall to listen. Absolutely unsuitable, a woman's voice was saying, sharp with disdain. I cannot imagine what Lady Margaret was thinking, bringing her creature to such a gathering. She's pretty enough, another voice replied, this one male and lazily amused. In a common sort of way. Pretty. The first voice rose in outrage. She's nothing but a foundling with pretensions above her station. The very idea that she might think herself suitable company for her betters is laughable. Elena's blood turned to ice in her veins as she realized they were talking about her. She should have walked away, should have returned to the ballroom, and pretended she had heard nothing. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, unable to move as the words hit her like physical blows. Adrian seems to find her interesting enough, the male voice observed, and Elena heard something in his tone that made her skin crawl. I've seen him watching her all evening. Lord Adrian is merely being polite, the woman snapped. He would never seriously consider someone so far beneath his station. He knows his duty to his family name. Of course, the man agreed, but there was amusement in his voice that suggested he thought otherwise, though it might be amusing to see how far she might be willing to go to secure his attention. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. She had known her position was precarious, had understood that she existed on the sufferance of others, but hearing it stated so bluntly felt like being stripped naked in public. She turned and fled back toward the ballroom, her cheeks burning with humiliation and something dangerously close to rage. The beautiful gown that had made her feel almost elegant now seemed like a costume, a pitiful attempt to disguise what everyone could see clearly, that she did not belong in this world of privilege and power. She was so focused on her escape that she did not see the figure stepping out of an alcove until she collided with him, her forward momentum carrying her directly into a chest that felt like granite beneath fine wool. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and she looked up to find herself staring into the very eyes that had haunted her thoughts all evening. Lord Adrian held her for a moment longer than propriety dictated, his fingers warm against her bare arms, his gaze searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Miss Blackwood," he said softly, and something in his voice suggested he knew exactly why she was fleeing. "Are you quite well?" Elena tried to step back, tried to put proper distance between them, but his hands tightened slightly on her shoulders, holding her in place. She could feel the heat of his body even through the layers of their clothing, could smell the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and something darker that made her head swim. "I'm perfectly fine, my lord," she managed, though her voice betrayed the lie. "I was simply escaping," he finished for her, and there was something almost gentle in his tone that undid her more completely than cruelty would have. From voices that speak without wisdom or compassion. Elena's eyes widened in shock. He had heard the conversation, had witnessed her humiliation, and somehow that made it infinitely worse. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back furiously, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, though they both knew it was another lie. "They're only speaking the truth." "Are they?" His voice was dangerously soft, and Elena felt something shift in the air between them. "And what truth would that be, Miss Blackwood?" Elena lifted her chin, summoning the last of her pride. "That I don't belong here. That I'm nothing but a foundling with pretensions above my station." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Elena watched as something dark and predatory flickered in Lord Adrian's eyes. His hands moved from her shoulders to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "You are," he said with quiet intensity, "the most beautiful woman in that ballroom, and anyone who suggests otherwise is a fool." Elena felt the world tilt around her, felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble beneath the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lose herself in the promise she heard in his voice, but reality was a cold hand on her shoulder, reminding her of all the reasons why this could never be. "My lord," she began, but he silenced her by placing one finger against her lips. "Dance with me," he said, and it was not a request. Elena's heart stopped, then began beating double time. Dancing with Lord Adrian would be social suicide, would mark her as reaching far above her station and destroy what little reputation she had managed to maintain. But looking into his eyes, she found that she did not care. "Yes," she whispered, and let him lead her back into the ballroom, back into the light and music and the shocked stares of everyone who had thought they knew exactly where she belonged. The ballroom fell silent as Lord Adrian led her onto the dance floor, a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Every eye in the room was fixed on them, every face registering various degrees of shock, outrage, and fascination. Elena felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical presence, but she kept her chin up and her spine straight as Lord Adrian positioned her for the waltz. His hand at her waist burned through the silk of her gown, his fingers intertwined with hers in a grip that was both gentle and possessive. The music began, a sweeping melody that seemed to wrap around them like silk, and then they were moving together across the polished floor with a grace that suggested they had been dancing together for years rather than moments. Elena had learned to waltz in her grandmother's cottage, practicing the steps on floors of rough wood while humming melodies she had heard through church windows, but she had never danced like this. Lord Adrian moved with fluid confidence, guiding her through the steps with subtle pressure that made her feel weightless, ethereal. She found herself following his lead instinctively, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization as if they shared the same heartbeat. "Ignore them," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "There is nothing in this room but you and me and the music." Elena felt herself melting into him, felt the careful walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. This close, she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could feel the controlled strength in the arms that held her. He smelled of sandalwood and midnight, of secrets and promises that she dare not examine too closely. "They're watching," she whispered, though she found it increasingly difficult to care what anyone thought. "Let them watch," he replied, spinning her in a turn that made her skirts flare around them like water. "Let them see what real beauty looks like." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she could not look away from his face, could not break the spell that seemed to bind them together on this dance floor that had become their own private world. The other dancers moved around them like ghosts, their presence dimming until they might have been dancing alone in an empty ballroom. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why are you doing this?" Lord Adrian's grip tightened slightly, pulling her closer until she could feel the hard planes of his chest against her body. His eyes darkened, and something predatory flickered in their depths that made her pulse quicken. "Because," he said softly, "from the moment you entered my house, you have haunted my thoughts. Because you move through my world like a ghost, beautiful and untouchable. Because you are the first woman in years who has looked at me and seen something other than my title or my wealth." Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. The words were dangerous, impossible, everything she had dreamed of hearing, and everything she knew could destroy them both. She wanted to protest, to remind him of all the reasons why this was madness, but the look in his eyes silenced her. "I am nobody," she whispered instead, the words barely audible above the music. "You are everything," he countered, and the intensity in his voice made her knees weak. "You are fire wrapped in silk, strength disguised as fragility. You are the storm I have been waiting for my entire life." The waltz was ending, the music winding down to its final notes, but neither of them moved to break their embrace. They stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, lost in each other's eyes while the rest of the ballroom held its collective breath. Then the spell was broken by a voice that cut through the silence like a blade. "Adrian!" Elena turned to see Lady Catherine Pembroke approaching them, her beautiful face a mask of barely controlled fury. Behind her, Lady Margaret stood with her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval, her pale blue eyes shooting daggers at Elena. "Lady Catherine," Lord Adrian said smoothly, though he did not release Elena from his arms. "How lovely you look this evening." "I believe," Lady Catherine said with honeyed venom, "that you promised me this dance." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to step back, to remove herself from a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control, but Lord Adrian's arm tightened around her waist, holding her in place. "I'm afraid," he said with cool politeness, "that I have no memory of making such a promise." Lady Catherine's eyes flashed with rage, and Elena saw her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Perhaps your memory has been clouded by unsuitable company. The insult hit its mark, and Elena felt shame burn through her like acid. She was a fool to have allowed herself to be swept away by his words, to have forgotten even for a moment the gulf that separated them. She belonged in the shadows, in the spaces between other people's lives, not in the spotlight of a ballroom dance floor. "You're right," Elena said quietly, finding her voice at last. "I should not have—" "Miss Blackwood," Lord Adrian interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that made her look up at him in surprise, "has nothing to apologize for." He turned his attention back to Lady Catherine, and Elena shivered at the ice she heard in his tone. "However, I find myself growing weary of this particular entertainment. Miss Blackwood, would you care for some air?" Elena's heart stopped. He was asking her to leave with him, to abandon the ballroom and all its watching eyes for the privacy of the gardens. It was scandalous, impossible, social suicide for them both. "Yes," she heard herself say, and let him lead her from the dance floor while the entire assembly watched in stunned silence. The gardens at Hartwell House were a masterpiece of landscape design, with winding paths that led through carefully cultivated wilderness illuminated by paper lanterns strung between the trees. The night air was cool against Elena's heated skin, carrying the scent of jasmine and night-blooming roses that made her head swim with their sweetness. Lord Adrian walked beside her in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, but Elena could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. They had crossed a line tonight, had stepped beyond the boundaries of what was permissible, and she did not know what would happen next. "You should not have done that," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will never forgive you for dancing with me." "And do you imagine," he replied, his voice dangerously soft, "that I care what they think?" Elena stopped walking and turned to face him, seeing him clearly in the lamplight for perhaps the first time. There was something wild in his eyes, something that spoke of leashed power and barely contained emotion. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to throw himself into the void. "You should care," she said desperately. "You have responsibilities, obligations, a duty to your family name." "My duty," he said, moving closer until she could feel the heat of his body, "is to myself, to my own happiness. And what of Lady Catherine? What of all the suitable young women who would gladly accept your proposal?" Lord Adrian laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Suitable," he repeated, as if the word tasted bitter on his tongue. "Do you know what suitable means, Miss Blackwood? It means passionless. It means marrying for convenience rather than desire. It means spending the rest of my life pretending to be content with half a heart." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced them back. "And what would you have me do? Become your mistress, live in the shadows while you marry someone else?" The words hung between them like a blade, and Elena saw something flicker in Lord Adrian's eyes that might have been pain. He reached for her then, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that undid her completely. "I would have you," he said simply, "be mine, in every way that matters." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the world shift around her like sand beneath her feet. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the promise she heard in his voice, but reality was a cold presence at her shoulder, reminding her of all the ways this could end in disaster. "It's impossible," she whispered, though the words tore at her throat. "You know it is." "Is it?" His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she had not realized were falling. "I am master of my own fate, Elena. I choose whom I will love." The sound of her given name on his lips sent shivers through her entire body. No one had called her Elena since her grandmother died, had spoken her name with such tenderness. She opened her eyes and found herself drowning in his gaze, in the promise of everything she had ever dreamed of and never dared to hope for. "Adrian," she breathed, and saw his pupils dilate at the sound of his name spoken so intimately. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Adrian," she repeated, and then his mouth was on hers, claiming her with a kiss that tasted of desperation and desire and everything that had been building between them since the moment they met. Elena felt herself melt against him, felt all her careful defenses crumble beneath the onslaught of sensation. His lips were warm and demanding, moving against hers with a skill that made her knees weak. She had never been kissed before, had never known that a simple touch could set her entire body on fire. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as if they could not bear to be separated even by inches. Elena felt as if she had been fundamentally changed, as if the woman who had entered this garden was not the same one who stood here now. "Come away with me," Adrian whispered against her lips, his voice urgent with need. "Tonight, we can be married by special license, away from all of this." Elena's heart soared at the words, but even as she felt herself beginning to nod, she heard the sound of voices coming down the path toward them. Reality crashed over her like cold water, reminding her of everything they stood to lose. "Someone's coming," she gasped, pulling back from his embrace. Adrian cursed softly, but stepped away from her just as Lady Margaret appeared around a bend in the path, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Behind her came Lord Hartwell and several other guests, their expressions ranging from scandal to speculation. "Elena," Lady Margaret said, her voice sharp as a whip crack, "you will return to the house immediately." Elena felt the weight of their collective disapproval like a physical presence, but she lifted her chin and met Lady Margaret's gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. She had crossed the Rubicon tonight. There was no going back to what she had been before. "Of course, my lady," she said quietly, but she made no move to follow the older woman. "Now," Lady Margaret snapped, and Elena heard the threat beneath the word. But before she could respond, Adrian stepped forward, placing himself between Elena and the group of censorious faces. "Miss Blackwood," he said formally, though his eyes promised so much more, "will be traveling under my protection from now on." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Elena heard Lady Margaret's sharp intake of breath, saw the shock and outrage on the faces around them. She had become the center of a scandal that would be whispered about in drawing rooms across the county. "Adrian," Lord Hartwell said carefully, "perhaps you should reconsider." "My mind is quite made up," Adrian interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Miss Blackwood and I are to be married." Elena felt the world tilt around her, felt everything she had thought she knew about her future dissolve like mist. He was proposing to her, here in front of witnesses who could spread the news across 3 counties before morning. "You cannot be serious," Lady Margaret sputtered, her composure finally cracking completely. "She is nobody, nothing. A foundling with no family, no fortune, no connections that matter." "She is," Adrian said with quiet intensity, "the woman I love." Elena felt tears stream down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She looked at Adrian's face, saw the determination there, the absolute certainty, and felt her last defenses crumble. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of forever. "Yes." Adrian's smile was brilliant in the lamplight, transforming his face from severe beauty to something radiant. He took her hand in his, raised it to his lips, and pressed a kiss to her palm that sealed their fate. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice carrying across the garden like a proclamation. "Miss Blackwood has consented to be my wife." The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and cacophonous. Shock, outrage, speculation, and beneath it all, the sound of a world shifting on its axis. Elena stood in the center of it all, her hand clasped in Adrian's, and felt for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she belonged. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church on the Ravenwood estate, with only a handful of witnesses present to see Elena Blackwood transformed into Lady Adrian Ashford. She wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and carried wildflowers picked from the meadows where she had played as a child. Lady Margaret had departed Ravenwood the morning after the announcement, taking her disapproval and her wounded pride back to her own estate. The London gossips had feasted on the scandal for days before moving on to fresher meat, leaving Elena to begin her new life in relative peace. As she stood before the altar, listening to the ancient words that would bind her to Adrian forever, Elena thought of all the voices that had told her she was nothing, that she belonged nowhere. They had been wrong, all of them. She belonged here, in this moment, beside the man who had seen past the surface to the strength beneath. Adrian's hand was warm and steady in hers as they spoke their vows, his voice strong and sure as he promised to love and protect her for as long as they both should live. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar, and Elena knew that she had found her home at last. The reception was a small, intimate affair held in the great hall at Ravenwood, with the servants who had come to care for Elena over the months of her employment, celebrating alongside the few family friends who had chosen to attend despite the scandal. Elena moved through it all as if in a dream, still hardly able to believe that this was real, that she was truly Lady Ashford now. As the evening wore on and the guests departed, Elena found herself alone with Adrian in the library where they had first truly spoken. He was standing by the fireplace, the flames casting shadows across his face, and she felt her breath catch at the sight of him. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, suddenly uncertain. "Giving up everything for me?" Adrian turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart race. "I gave up nothing," he said, moving toward her with predatory grace. "I gained everything." He pulled her into his arms, and Elena felt the last of her fears melt away beneath the heat of his touch. This was where she belonged, where she had always belonged. In the arms of the man who had seen her worth when no one else would, who had been willing to defy society itself for the chance to call her his own. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the words she had been afraid to speak finally finding their voice. "And I love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "My beautiful, impossible wife." As he kissed her, Elena felt the last pieces of her old life fall away like shed skin. She was no longer the foundling girl who had lived on the charity of others, no longer the shadow in the corner who existed only at the margins of other people's lives. She was Lady Adrian Ashford, beloved and cherished, mistress of Ravenwood, and keeper of a heart that had waited a lifetime to find its home. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, but inside, wrapped in Adrian's arms, Elena felt only warmth and the promise of forever. She had found her place in the world at last, found the love that had eluded her for so long. And as the fire crackled in the grate and the rain sang against the glass, Elena Ashford, for that was who she was now and would be forever, closed her eyes and let herself believe in happily ever after. The months that followed their wedding were the happiest of Elena's life. She threw herself into her new role as mistress of Ravenwood with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through years of uncertainty. The servants, who had initially viewed her with suspicion, soon came to respect her gentle authority and genuine concern for their welfare. Adrian watched her transformation with eyes that grew more admiring each day. The timid companion, who had once faded into the background, had blossomed into a woman of grace and confidence, her natural intelligence finding outlets in the management of his estates and the careful cultivation of relationships with their neighbors. Not everyone accepted the change with equanimity. Lady Catherine Pembroke and her circle of friends continued to snub Elena at social gatherings, their smiles sharp as knives and their conversation pointed with subtle insults. But Elena found that their disapproval had lost its power to wound her. She had Adrian's love, his unwavering support, and that was armor enough against any slight. On quiet evenings, they would sit together in the library, Elena reading aloud from novels while Adrian worked on correspondence or simply watched her with an expression of such contentment that it made her heart overflow. These were the moments she treasured most, the simple, domestic intimacy of two people who had found their perfect match. "Do you miss it?" Adrian asked one evening, looking up from his papers to find her gazing out at the gardens where they had first kissed. "Your old life?" Elena considered the question seriously, thinking of the small cottage where she had lived with her grandmother, of the uncertainty and loneliness that had defined her existence before Ravenwood. "I miss my grandmother," she said finally. "I miss the woman who taught me that worth comes from within, not from what others think of you. But my old life—" She shook her head, turning to smile at him. "I was merely surviving then. Now I'm truly living." Adrian rose from his desk and crossed to where she sat, pulling her up into his arms with the easy familiarity of a man secure in his wife's affection. "Then I am content," he murmured against her hair. "For you are my life now, Elena. My heart, my soul, my everything." As autumn gave way to winter, Elena discovered that she was with child. The news filled her with a joy so profound it took her breath away, but also with a fear she could not name. She had lost so much in her life, her parents, her grandmother, her place in the world, That happiness felt fragile, precious, something that could be snatched away without warning. Adrian, when she told him, swept her up in his arms and spun her around the morning room until she was dizzy with laughter. His joy was uncomplicated, absolute, and it helped quiet the whispered fears that plagued her dreams. "Our child," he said wonderingly, his hand resting on her still flat stomach with a reverence that made her eyes fill with tears. "A perfect combination of your strength and my stubbornness." "Heaven help us," Elena laughed, covering his hand with hers. "The poor child will be impossible." But as spring approached and her pregnancy became visible to all, Elena found herself thinking often of the voices from her past, the ones that had told her she was nothing, that she belonged nowhere. What would those voices say now? She wondered, seeing her surrounded by luxury and love, carrying the heir to one of the county's most prestigious estates. The answer came sooner than she expected. Lady Margaret arrived at Ravenwood on a gray April morning, her carriage pulling up to the front door with a finality that made Elena's heart sink. She had not seen the older woman since her departure after the engagement announcement, and the intervening months had done nothing to soften the lines of disapproval carved into her aristocratic features. Elena received her in the drawing-room, her hands folded carefully over the small swell of her belly, her spine straight despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Lady Margaret's pale blue eyes swept over her with a kind of assessment that Elena remembered all too well. "So," Lady Margaret said without preamble, settling herself in the chair she had always favored during Elena's employment, "you have managed to secure yourself quite thoroughly." Elena felt the old familiar sting of the woman's casual cruelty, but it had lost much of its power to wound. "I prefer to think," she said calmly, "that Adrian and I secured each other." Lady Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "How romantic! How naive!" She leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "Do you truly believe this will last? That he will not grow tired of playing at love with his pretty little foundling?" The words hit their mark, finding the soft spots in Elena's armor that she had thought were healed. But before she could respond, she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway, and then Adrian was standing in the doorway, his face dark with anger. "Lady Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a chill that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "How unexpected, and how unwelcome." "Adrian!" Lady Margaret rose with dignity that did not quite hide her discomfort. "I came to congratulate you on your interesting domestic arrangements." "Then you have fulfilled your purpose," Adrian replied coolly, moving to stand behind Elena's chair with protective presence. "And may now take your leave." Lady Margaret's composure cracked slightly, revealing the bitter resentment beneath. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Throwing away everything your family built for a pretty face and a pair of violet eyes. But mark my words, blood will tell. She will never be truly one of us, no matter how fine the gowns you dress her in." Elena felt Adrian's hand tighten on her shoulder, felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. But when she looked up at him, she saw not anger but a kind of calm certainty that steadied her racing heart. "You're quite right," he said quietly, and Elena felt her breath catch. "She will never be one of us." Lady Margaret smiled triumphantly, but Adrian was not finished. "She is something far better. She is kind where we are cruel, generous where we are selfish, strong where we are weak. She has faced hardship and loss, and emerged with her compassion intact, her dignity unbroken. She is everything I could never be, everything I never knew I needed." He paused, his hand moving to rest over Elena's, over the place where their child grew. "And she is carrying my heir, a child who will inherit not just my name and fortune, but her courage and her grace. I consider myself the most fortunate man alive." Lady Margaret's face went white with rage, but before she could speak, Adrian continued. "Now, I believe I asked you to leave. If you cannot do so with dignity, I will be happy to have you escorted from the premises." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Lady Margaret gathered her composure around her like armor, but Elena could see the defeat in her eyes. She had come here to destroy, to plant seeds of doubt and discord, and instead had witnessed something that rendered her powerless, a love so absolute, so unshakable, that her poison could not touch it. "This is not finished," Lady Margaret said as she moved toward the door, but her voice lacked conviction. "Oh, but it is," Adrian replied softly. "It finished the moment I saw Elena standing in my hallway, looking like she was made of sunlight and shadow. Everything before that was merely prologue." After Lady Margaret's departure, Elena sat in the garden where she and Adrian had first kissed, her hands resting on her growing belly as she watched clouds gather on the horizon. The encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit, had awakened old fears about her worthiness, her place in Adrian's world. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path, and looked up to see him approaching with that fluid grace that still made her heart race. He settled beside her on the stone bench, his presence warm and solid and reassuring. "You're thinking too much," he observed, and Elena could hear the smile in his voice. She wasn't entirely wrong. Elena said quietly, "I will never truly be one of them. There will always be people who see me as the foundling girl who reached above her station." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and when Elena looked at him, she saw that he was considering her words seriously rather than dismissing them. "Do you remember," he said finally, "the first time we danced?" Elena nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks at the memory. "I knew then that I was lost," Adrian continued. "Not because you were beautiful, though you are, but because you moved through that ballroom like you belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. You were yourself, completely and unapologetically, even when the entire room was judging you." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense with emotion. "That's what I fell in love with, Elena. Not the idea of you, not the challenge of raising you up, but you, exactly as you are. And if there are people who cannot see your worth, then that is their failing, not yours." Elena felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. This man, this impossible, wonderful man, had seen her truly from the beginning, had loved her not despite her origins, but because of who they had shaped her to become. "I love you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "And I love you," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "My beautiful, impossible wife, the mother of my children, the keeper of my heart." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Elena felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Let the world think what it would. Let them whisper and speculate and disapprove. She had found her home, her purpose, her place in the grand design of things. She was no longer Elena Blackwood, the foundling with no family and no prospects. She was Lady Elena Ashford, beloved wife and soon-to-be mother, mistress of Ravenwood, and guardian of a love that had transformed them both. And that, she thought as Adrian's hand covered hers over their unborn child, was worth more than all the approval in the world. The baby was born on a warm September evening, as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Elena held her daughter for the first time and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of love. She had thought her heart was full before, but looking down at the tiny face that was a perfect blend of her features and Adrian's, she realized she had known nothing about the capacity for feeling. "She's perfect," Adrian breathed, his voice rough with emotion as he traced one finger along their daughter's downy cheek. "Look at her, Elena. She's absolutely perfect." Elena smiled through her tears, exhausted but exhilarated by the miracle they had created together. "What shall we call her?" "Hope," Adrian said without hesitation, and Elena understood immediately. This child was hope made manifest, hope for the future, hope for a love that would outlast them both, hope that sometimes the impossible could become reality. "Lady Hope Ashford," Elena murmured, testing the name on her tongue. "It has a lovely sound to it." As autumn deepened into winter, Elena settled into the rhythm of motherhood with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every transition in her life. Hope was a good baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and watching Adrian with his daughter was a joy that never grew old. He was a devoted father, completely enchanted by every small development in Hope's abilities. He would spend hours simply watching her sleep, his expression soft with wonder, and Elena would find herself falling in love with him all over again. "She has your eyes," he told Elena one evening as they sat before the fire, Hope cradled in her arms. "That same violet shade, like twilight sky." "But your stubborn chin," Elena replied, laughing softly. "Already she argues when it's time for her bath." "Intelligent girl," Adrian said approvingly. "She knows her own mind. The years that followed were golden ones. filled with the kind of simple happiness that Elena had never dared to dream possible. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who charmed everyone she met, and Elena found herself pregnant again when their daughter was 2 years old. This time, she carried a son who entered the world with his father's dark hair and commanding presence, though he had inherited his mother's gentle disposition. They named him James, and watching Adrian teach his children to ride and read and understand their responsibilities as Ashfords filled Elena with a contentment so deep it felt like peace. The London season still held little appeal for her, though she and Adrian attended enough social functions to maintain their standing in society. The whispers about her origins had largely died down, replaced by acknowledgement that Lady Ashford had proved herself a worthy addition to the family name. But it was the quiet moments at Ravenwood that Elena treasured most. Evenings spent in the library with Adrian reading aloud while the children played at their feet, walks through the gardens where they had first kissed, lazy afternoons when they would picnic by the stream that ran through their property and watch their children chase butterflies through the meadow grass. "Are you happy?" Adrian asked her one such afternoon, as they lay on a blanket beneath an ancient oak tree, Hope and James napping in the shade nearby. Elena considered the question seriously, looking back over the journey that had brought her from her grandmother's cottage to this moment. She thought of all the voices that had told her she was nothing, all the time she had felt lost and alone and uncertain of her place in the world. "Happy seems too small a word," she said finally. "I feel complete, like all the broken pieces of my life have finally arranged themselves into something beautiful." Adrian rolled onto his side to face her, his gray eyes warm with love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to Ravenwood? If we had never met?" Elena shook her head. "I can't imagine it. I think we were always meant to find each other. All the pain, all the loneliness, it was just the path that led me to you." "Then I am grateful for every step of that path," Adrian said, leaning down to kiss her with the same tenderness that had characterized their love from the beginning. "Even the painful ones, especially the painful ones." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Elena gathered her sleeping children in her arms and followed Adrian back to the house. Ravenwood Manor rose before them in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing with warm light, and Elena felt her heart swell with gratitude for all the blessings that filled her life. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived here with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a heart full of hope. She had become the woman she was always meant to be, loved, cherished, secure in her place in the world. And as they entered the house together, her children safe in her arms and her husband's hand warm in hers, Elena knew that she had found what she had been searching for all her life. She had found home. The years flowed by like water through gentle streams, each one adding depth and richness to the life Elena had built at Ravenwood. Hope grew into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence, with her mother's violet eyes and her father's commanding presence. James developed into a thoughtful boy who showed early promise in both scholarship and leadership, beloved by the tenants who would one day look to him as their lord. Elena herself had settled into her role as Lady Ashford with a grace that surprised even those who had once doubted her suitability for the position. She managed the estate with efficiency and compassion, earned the respect of their neighbors through her charitable works, and raised her children with the same blend of strength and gentleness that had sustained her through her own difficult youth. But it was in the quiet moments with Adrian that she found her greatest joy. Their love had deepened over the years, seasoned by shared triumphs and sorrows, strengthened by the daily choice to choose each other again and again. They had weathered the challenges that came to every marriage, the death of elderly relatives, concerns about the estate, the ordinary struggles of raising children, and emerged even more united. "Do you remember," Adrian said one evening as they walked through the gardens where their love had first bloomed, "when you told me you were nobody?" Elena smiled, her hand secure in his, as they paused beside the fountain where moonlight turned the water to liquid silver. "I was very young then," she replied. "Very foolish." "No," Adrian corrected gently. "You were very brave. It takes courage to believe you deserve love when everyone around you suggests otherwise." Elena leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of sandalwood and home. "And it takes courage to love someone the world considers unsuitable." "The world," Adrian said with quiet conviction, "was wrong about you. as it is wrong about so many things. As they stood together in the place where their story had truly begun, Elena reflected on the unlikely path that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a foundling with no family, no fortune, no prospects beyond service to others. But she had refused to let that define her, had held fast to her belief that she was worthy of more. And in the end, she had found more than she had ever dared to dream. Not just love, but a love that transformed everything it touched. Not just a home, but a legacy that would outlive them both in the children they had raised and the lives they had touched. "Thank you," she whispered into the stillness of the night. "For what?" Adrian asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "For seeing me," Elena replied. "For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. For showing me that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for the right moment to become inevitable." Adrian's arms tightened around her, and she felt the familiar warmth of his love envelop her like a benediction. They had faced the world together and emerged victorious, not through conquest, but through the simple, radical act of choosing love over fear. And as they walked back toward the house where their children slept safely in their beds, Elena knew that their story would continue long after they were gone. In Hope's laughter and James's determination, in the estate they had improved and the community they had served, in the simple truth that love could triumph over any obstacle when it was pure and true and strong enough to endure. She had been right, that young woman who had danced with a lord despite every voice telling her she didn't belong. She had belonged here all along, not because of her birth or her beauty or her accomplishments, but because her heart had found its home in this place, with this man, in this life they had built together from nothing more than hope and determination and love. And that, Elena thought as she looked up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, was the most beautiful ending to any story she could imagine. Except it wasn't an ending at all. It was simply another beginning, another chapter in a love story that would echo through generations yet to come, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the places we expect, but in the courage to reach for what seems impossible. Sometimes the foundling becomes the lady. Sometimes the servant becomes the mistress. Sometimes love conquers all the voices that say it cannot be. Sometimes, against all odds and expectations, dreams really do come true. Yenny, if the story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share it. Sometimes, what hurts within us is what makes us most human.